The floorboard groaned, a low, mournful sound that seemed to rise from the very earth. Dust motes danced in the sliver of light from the lantern, illuminating a darkness that had held its breath for half a century. A metallic glint, a secret whispered in rust and resin, promised either salvation or a new kind of damnation. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The cold of the late autumn afternoon had settled deep into Sarah's bones, a damp, persistent chill that her thin city coat could no longer fend off. It was a cold that felt less like weather and more like a premonition. Before them, half, swallowed by a silent army of encroaching pines, stood the cabin. Its wood was weathered to a ghostly gray, the porch sagged with the weariness of 100 forgotten seasons, and a single grimy window stared out at them like a vacant eye. The air, thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth, felt heavy in her lungs. Her beat, up sedan, its engine ticking softly as it cooled, was crammed with the fragmented remains of a life she no longer recognized. Boxes, bags, and a stray lampshade pressed against the rear window, a testament to how quickly a comfortable suburban existence could be condensed into what little could fit in a trunk and a back seat. Her ex-husband's parting words, a symphony of casual cruelty, echoed in her mind, each syllable a fresh twist of the knife. "You wanted to be independent," he'd sneered. "This is what it looks like." Her 10-year-old son, Leo, stood beside her, his small shoulders hunched against the wind. He clutched a worn video game console in his hands, its screen dark, his knuckles white. His silence was a heavy blanket of worry she didn't know how to lift. Gus, their aging brown Labrador, whined softly at her feet, his warm, solid presence the only comfort in this desolate landscape. He nudged his head against her leg, his tail giving a single, uncertain thump against the gravel. "It's small," Leo finally said, his voice barely a whisper, lost almost immediately to the sighing of the wind through the pines. Sarah forced a brightness into her tone that felt like a betrayal of the despair clawing at her throat. "It's cozy," she countered, turning to him with a smile that felt brittle enough to shatter. "An adventure." Leo didn't look convinced. His gaze remained fixed on the cabin, on the dark, uninviting doorway that waited for them. The sense of isolation was oppressive, a physical weight pressing down on them. The nearest neighbor was miles away, the town a forgotten speck on a map she'd had to study for an hour just to find. This was it, the end of the line. With a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic fluttering in her chest, she squared her shoulders. She was a mother. She had to be strong. For him. She pasted the brittle smile back on her face and gave him a gentle nudge. "Come on, adventurer. Let's go claim our castle." Inside, the cabin was even more dilapidated than it had appeared from the outside. The single room was a study in neglect. A hulking, pot-bellied wood stove, its surface a patchwork of rust, dominated one corner. A small sink, stained a permanent shade of ochre, clung to a wall of warped planking. A few pieces of discarded furniture, a wobbly table and two mismatched chairs, huddled together in the center of the room as if for warmth. The wind, no longer just a sigh, whistled a shrill, lonely tune through the countless cracks in the walls. As the last of the daylight faded, the shadows in the corners deepened, seeming to writhe and stretch in the growing dark. Sarah and Leo moved with a grim, silent determination, their earlier attempt at forced cheerfulness abandoned. They unpacked their sleeping bags, rolling them out on the dusty floorboards that groaned under every footstep. Gus, sensing the palpable tension in the small space, whined softly, circling a small patch of floor before collapsing with a heavy sigh, his chin resting on his paws as he watched them with sad, liquid eyes. Sarah's hands fumbled as she crumpled newspaper and arranged kindling in the belly of the wood stove, her frustration mounting with each failed attempt to strike a match with trembling fingers. Finally, a tiny flame caught, wavering precariously before growing into a small, hungry fire. The light pushed back the encroaching darkness, painting the grim interior with a warm, flickering glow. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Later, they sat on their sleeping bags, eating lukewarm canned soup directly from the can with plastic spoons. The fire crackled and popped, a cheerful counterpoint to the mournful howl of the wind outside. The small pocket of warmth it offered felt like a sanctuary, a tiny island of hope in a vast, dark ocean of uncertainty. Sarah watched her son, his face illuminated by the firelight. He was so quiet, so contained, his young face a mask of stoicism that broke her heart. She reached out, her fingers brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "We'll make this work," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "We just need a little time." Leo looked up from his soup, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. He didn't say anything, but he gave her a small, hesitant nod. It was enough. For now it had to be. As he settled into his sleeping bag, with Gus curled up at his feet, Sarah stayed awake, staring into the flames. She fought back the tears that burned at the back of her eyes, the crushing weight of their new reality threatening to suffocate her. She had to be strong for Leo. She had to be. But as the fire died down to glowing embers and the cold began to seep back into the room, she felt a profound and terrifying loneliness settle over her, as vast and as dark as the wilderness that surrounded them. A few days later, a fragile routine had begun to form. They woke with the sun, their breath misting in the cold morning air. They ate oatmeal cooked on the wood stove and spent their days exploring the woods around the cabin, Gus bounding ahead, his tail a joyful metronome. But a persistent, insidious cold draft had become Sarah's nemesis. It blew from a spot near the wood stove, a constant, chilling reminder of the cabin's vulnerability. It was a small thing, a minor inconvenience, but in her frayed state, it felt like a personal affront. Another battle in a war she was already losing. Determined to patch the draft, she was on her hands and knees, her face close to the floor, tracing the seams of the wide plank boards with her fingertips. The wood was rough and splintered, the gaps between the boards filled with the dust and grime of decades. As she pressed down, testing for loose spots, one of the boards near the base of the stove gave slightly, letting out a low, hollow groan. It was different from the usual creaks and groans of the old cabin. This was a sound of emptiness, of space where there should have been solid earth. Her curiosity piqued. She pressed down again, harder this time. The hollow sound was unmistakable. The draft was forgotten. A jolt of adrenaline, sharp and sudden, shot through her. She scrambled to her feet and rummaged through one of the unpacked boxes, her hands searching for the putty knife she'd brought for minor repairs. Armed with the thin, flexible blade, she returned to the spot. She knelt, the cold of the floor seeping through the knees of her jeans, and carefully worked the edge of the knife into the seam. The board's nails, she discovered, were long rusted, their grip on the joists beneath tenuous at best. With a final, determined pry, the board lifted with surprising ease, the screech of the old nails a protest against the sudden intrusion of light and air. Beneath it, nestled in the dark, cool earth, lay a tin ammunition box. It was military green, its surface scarred with rust and time. It looked ancient, a relic from a forgotten war. She reached down, her fingers brushing away a layer of dry, crumbly soil. The box was heavy, far heavier than it should have been. She hooked her fingers under the handle and pulled. It was wedged tight, but with a grunt of effort, she worked it free from its earthen tomb. She set it on the floor beside her, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The lid was sealed shut, not with a lock, but with a thick, dark layer of hardened resin that had been slathered around the entire seam. She stared at it, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The draft, the cold, the gnawing despair of the past few days, it all faded away, replaced by a singular, overwhelming sense of intrigue. This was a secret, a mystery, a deviation from the bleak, predictable path she had been forced onto. The weight of the box felt significant, both physically and metaphorically. It was a tangible piece of the cabin's hidden history, a history that was now, for better or for worse, intertwined with her own. She ran a trembling hand over the rough, cold metal, 1,000 wild possibilities blooming in the fertile soil of her desperation. This box, she thought with a sudden, dizzying certainty, was going to change everything. Leo was asleep, a small, still form lost in the depths of his sleeping bag. His quiet, even breaths were the only sound in the cabin besides the gentle crackle of the last log smoldering in the wood stove and the incessant whisper of the wind outside. The lantern on the floor cast long, dancing shadows that turned the familiar shapes of their meager possessions into monstrous, distorted figures. Sarah sat on the cold floorboards, the tin ammunition box squatting before her like a malevolent toad. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. For over an hour she worked, with the putty knife in one hand and a heavy, smooth rock she'd found by the hearth in the other. She chipped away at the thick, black resin that sealed the box's seam. It was a slow, arduous process. The resin was as hard as stone, and each chip flew off with a sharp crack, a tiny explosion in the quiet room. Her fingers grew numb, her wrist ached, but she didn't stop. The anticipation was a physical thing, a coiling knot of fear and hope in the pit of her stomach. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the putty knife slid into a crack and, with a sharp twist, a long section of the seal broke free. A puff of stale, musty air, the captured breath of a bygone era, escaped from within. Her own breath hitched. Using the knife as a lever, she worked the lid, prying it up inch by agonizing inch. It resisted, groaning and screeching in protest, the sound of metal on metal a violation of the night's stillness. Then, with a final, shuddering groan, the lid gave way. She stared, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. Inside, nestled in the dark interior, was a bundle wrapped in thick, oiled cloth. It was tied with twine that had grown brittle with age. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely untie the knot. She fumbled with it, her nails scraping against the rough twine, before finally pulling it loose. She peeled back the stiff, greasy layers of cloth. And there they were, stacks of them, thick stacks of paper, held together with faded paper bands. They weren't dollar bills. They were something else. Something she had only ever read about in novels or seen in old movies. Bearer bonds. Each one was intricately engraved, a work of art in its own right, with a face value printed in bold, stark numbers. She picked up the top stack, the paper cool and crisp against her fingertips. Her eyes scanned the denominations, her mind struggling to do the arithmetic. The numbers swam before her eyes, blurring and reforming into an impossible, staggering sum. $2 million. A wave of dizziness washed over her, so intense she had to place a hand on the floor to steady herself. $2 million. The words echoed in the silent cabin, a pronouncement of such magnitude it seemed to suck all the air from the room. She touched the paper again, half, expecting it to crumble to dust, a cruel illusion born of desperation. But it was real, solid. It was the weight of a future she had thought was lost forever. It was a new school for Leo, a proper house with more than one room, a life without the constant, gnawing fear of not having enough. It was escape. It was salvation. But as the initial shock began to recede, a new emotion, cold and sharp, pierced through the dizzying hope. Fear. This wasn't a lottery ticket. This wasn't an inheritance. A box of untraceable bonds, sealed with resin and buried under the floor of a deserted cabin. This was something else entirely. This was a secret, a dangerous, heavy $2 million secret, and it was hers. The next morning, the sun streamed through the grimy window, illuminating the same dusty room, the same mismatched chairs, the same sleeping bags on the floor. But everything was different. The very air in the cabin felt charged, humming with the energy of the secret that now lived within its walls. Sarah moved with a jerky, unnatural precision, her every movement carefully orchestrated to appear normal. She made oatmeal, her hands shaking as she stirred. She smiled at Leo, a wide, bright smile that felt like a mask she had glued to her face. He watched her from across the wobbly table, his brow furrowed. Gus, too, seemed to sense the change, staying close to her heels, his head cocked, his tail giving a low, uncertain wag. Before Leo was fully awake, she had carefully replaced the heavy ammunition box in its earthen nest, settling the floorboard back into place. To fit perfectly, the seam barely visible. But she knew it was there. It was a palpable presence, a sleeping dragon beneath their feet. The box itself, now empty of its treasure, she couldn't bring herself to rebury. The bonds, wrapped again in their oilcloth shroud, were another matter. She needed to hide them. Her eyes darted around the small cabin, searching for a place that was both secure and unremarkable. Finally, her gaze settled on a dusty, built-in cupboard next to the hearth. It was filled with a stack of old, moth-eaten blankets, probably left by the cabin's last occupant decades ago. They smelled of dust and time. It was perfect. She shoved the oilcloth, wrapped bundle deep into the back of the cupboard, burying it beneath the heavy, musty wool. Out of sight, but not out of mind. "Are you okay, Mom?" Leo's voice cut through her frantic thoughts. He was standing in the middle of the room, his video game console dangling forgotten from one hand. "You're being weird." Sarah spun around, the forced smile snapping back into place. "Just tired, sweetie," she said, her voice a little too high, a little too bright, thinking about all the things we need to do. It was a weak lie, and she knew he didn't believe it. The secret was already a wall between them, a new kind of isolation that felt sharper and more profound than the physical loneliness of the wilderness. She was alone with it, this monumental, terrifying discovery. And the paranoia had already begun to creep in, a slow, insidious vine wrapping itself around her thoughts. Every creak of the old cabin's wood, every gust of wind that rattled the window pane, sounded like a threat. Was that the sound of footsteps on the porch? Was that a car engine in the distance? She found herself holding her breath, straining to listen, her body coiled tight with a new and unfamiliar anxiety. The cabin, which had been a grim but necessary refuge, now felt like a cage, and she was the one who had just locked the door from the inside. The need for supplies, a mundane and unavoidable reality, finally forced her out of her self-imposed prison. The pantry was nearly bare, and the small town of Harmony Creek, a place she had been actively avoiding, was their only option. As she drove the winding dirt road, with Leo quiet in the passenger seat and Gus panting softly in the back, she felt a growing sense of dread. The town, when they reached it, was even more forgotten than she had imagined. It was a place where time seemed to have stopped somewhere in the 1980s. A single main street was lined with buildings whose facades were faded and peeling. There was a general store with a hand-painted sign, a gas station with 2 ancient pumps, and a small, brick building that housed the town's library. As she stepped out of the car, she felt it immediately. The stairs. They were subtle but unmistakable. A woman sweeping the sidewalk in front of a closed-down diner paused, her broom still, her eyes lingering on Sarah's car, on her out-of-place city clothes. A man leaning against the wall of the general store pushed his hat back and watched her with a flat, unreadable expression. They saw her for what she was, an outsider, a newcomer, a story to be whispered about over coffee that afternoon. As she walked towards the store, her head held high, she overheard 2 women talking by the post office. Their voices dropped as she approached, but she caught the words, sharp and clear as broken glass. "That old cabin can't be livable." Her pride, already bruised and battered, stung as if she'd been slapped. She felt both invisible and intensely scrutinized, a ghost and a specimen under a microscope all at once. The general store was a cavern of shadows, smelling of sawdust and old coffee. A grizzled man with a formidable beard stood behind the counter, his eyes missing nothing as she gathered a few essentials: milk, bread, eggs, canned soup. He rang up her purchases with a slow, deliberate efficiency, his silence a form of judgment in itself. As she paid, her hands fumbling with the last of her cash, a woman entered the store, the bell above the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt jarringly out of place. She was old, with a cloud of white hair and a face a roadmap of wrinkles. But her eyes were bright and sharp, and she gave Sarah a warm, wide smile. "New in town, dear?" she asked, her voice surprisingly strong. Sarah nodded, taken aback by the directness of the question. "Yes, we just moved into the cabin up on the ridge." The old woman's smile didn't falter, but something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of something that looked like knowledge. "Ah, the old hermit's place. That cabin has its secrets." She patted Sarah's arm, her touch surprisingly firm. "I'm Agnes. Welcome to Harmony Creek." The gesture was meant to be kind, a simple welcome, but it sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Agnes's smile was both comforting and deeply unsettling. It was a knowing smile. The town, which should have been a source of supplies, of potential connection, now felt like a place of judgment and hidden dangers. As Sarah hurried back to the car, her heart pounding, she clutched the bag of groceries like a shield. She felt more alone than ever, and the $2 million hidden in her cupboard felt less like a blessing and more like a ticking bomb. The library was her only option. The gnawing uncertainty was worse than any truth she might uncover. She had to know. On the pretext of finding books for Leo, a cover story that felt flimsy even to her, she guided him into the small brick building. The air inside was thick and musty, the scent of decaying paper and old leather hanging heavy and still. It was a place of profound silence, where the only sounds were the slow tick of a grandfather clock in the corner and the whisper of their own footsteps on the worn linoleum floor. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the dusty windows, casting long, hazy beams that illuminated swirling dust motes, tiny galaxies in the quiet gloom. An elderly librarian with glasses perched on the end of her nose looked up from a large, open book, her gaze lingering on them for a moment before returning to her page, the brief flicker of curiosity already extinguished. Sarah led Leo to a small children's section, a sad little corner with a few shelves of picture books and worn copies of childhood classics. "Why don't you find something to read, sweetie?" she murmured, her voice hushed, absorbed by the library's solemn atmosphere. "I'm just going to look something up." Leo, ever compliant, nodded and pulled a book from the shelf, settling himself at a small table, immediately lost in its pages. He was a lifeline, her anchor to a world that still made sense, and the sight of him, so calm and absorbed, gave her a sliver of the courage she so desperately needed. Her target was a single computer terminal, an ancient beige machine that looked like a museum piece. It hummed loudly, a discordant note in the library's silence. She sat down, the plastic chair cold against her legs, and took a deep breath. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, the keys yellowed with age. She felt like a spy, a criminal, her heart thudding a guilty rhythm against her ribs. She typed "bearer bonds" into the search engine, her fingers clumsy and stiff. The machine whirred and clicked, the page loading with agonizing slowness. She read with a ravenous intensity, her eyes scanning the text, absorbing the information. Untraceable, unregistered, payable to whoever holds them. The words confirmed her initial understanding, but they did little to soothe her. They were the financial equivalent of a ghost, a form of wealth that existed outside the system, with no name and no history attached. The articles she found also spoke of the difficulties in redeeming older bonds, especially in large quantities. Cashing them would be a delicate, dangerous dance, a process fraught with the risk of raising red flags, of inviting scrutiny she could not afford. Her research was a descent into a rabbit hole of financial regulations and legal warnings, but it was a different search that made the blood in her veins run cold. On a hunch, a terrible, sinking feeling that had been growing since her conversation with Agnes, she navigated to the library's digital newspaper archives. She typed in the name of the town, Harmony Creek, and the decade, the 1970s. The search results were a smattering of local news, announcements of bake sales and high school football scores. It was all so mundane, so normal. She was about to give up, to dismiss her fears as the product of an overactive imagination, when she saw it. A headline from a regional paper, dated October 1975. Brazen bank heist in Sterling City. Robber vanishes with unprecedented haul. Her breath caught in her throat. Sterling City was less than 100 miles away. She clicked on the link, her hand trembling. The article was grainy, the text slightly blurred, but the words were sharp and clear. A lone gunman had walked into the First National Bank of Sterling City and walked out with over $2 million in bearer bonds. He had been calm, methodical, his face obscured by a simple workman's cap and sunglasses. He had vanished without a trace. The money was never recovered. The authorities had few leads, but the article mentioned that the prime suspect was a known recluse, a man with a history of paranoia and a deep distrust of all government institutions. He was a ghost, a phantom who had dissolved back into the shadows from which he came. The article ended with a quote from the frustrated chief of police. "It's like the man and the money simply ceased to exist." A cold dread, heavy and suffocating, washed over Sarah. She stared at the screen, at the faded black and white photograph of the bank, her mind reeling. Couldn't be a coincidence. The amount, the nature of the assets, the timeline, it all fit. The money in her cupboard was not a miracle. It was stolen. The ghost of the bank robber, the reclusive man who had vanished, now haunted her discovery, his spectral presence tainting the dizzying hope she had so briefly allowed herself to feel. The $2 million was not a lifeline. It was a legacy of crime, a poisoned inheritance. She looked over at Leo, who was still engrossed in his book, his face a picture of innocence. The weight of the secret, now heavier and darker than ever, pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. The walk back to the general store was a blur. The cold dread from the library had settled into a hard, cold knot in her stomach. She needed more than a hypothesis. She needed confirmation. She needed to know the history of the man who had lived and died in her cabin. Entering the store for the second time that day, she felt the same oppressive silence, the same scrutinizing gaze from the bearded man behind the counter. She forced a smile, a pathetic, trembling thing, and approached the counter, picking up a chocolate bar and placing it in front of him, a flimsy excuse for her presence. "I was just wondering," she began, her voice sounding thin and reedy to her own ears. "You seem to know a lot about this town. I'm in the old cabin up on the ridge, and I'm just curious about its history." She tried to sound casual, like a newcomer making polite conversation, but she could hear the tremor in her voice, the desperate edge of her curiosity. The store owner looked at her, his eyes, small and dark, seeming to peer right through her carefully constructed facade. He took the chocolate bar and rang it up, his movements slow and deliberate. For a long moment he said nothing, simply polishing the already clean counter with a rag. The silence stretched, thick with his unspoken reluctance. Sarah's heart pounded. She was about to turn and leave, to flee from his silent judgment, when he finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Not much to tell," he said, not looking at her. "Place has been empty for the better part of 30 years. Before that, there was the old hermit." "The hermit?" Sarah prompted, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped polishing and leaned on the counter, his gaze drifting towards the window, towards the distant ridge where her cabin stood. "Yeah, strange old fella. Kept to himself. Came to town maybe twice a year for flour and salt. Paid in cash. Never said more than 5 words. Folks said he was hiding from something, but nobody knew what." He paused, his eyes returning to her, a flicker of something, maybe pity, in their depths. "Died in that cabin. Heart attack," the coroner said. "No family ever came to claim him. The town buried him. The cabin's just been sitting there ever since, rotting away." The story, so stark and simple, landed like a physical blow. Confirmed everything. The reclusive man from the newspaper article, the man hiding from something, it had to be him. He had brought his stolen treasure here, to this forgotten corner of the world, and he had died guarding it, alone in that small, dark room. The money wasn't just a legacy of crime. It was the life's work of a dead man. A man whose ghost, she now felt with a chilling certainty, still lingered in the place where he had drawn his last breath. The cabin was not just old. It had a dark and sordid history. It was a tomb, and she was living in it. She paid for the chocolate bar, her hands numb, and fled the store, the bell above the door sounding like a funeral toll. That night, a storm rolled in from the west, a furious, raging tempest that seemed to mirror the turmoil in her own soul. The wind howled like a banshee, shrieking through the pines and tearing at the small cabin with a relentless fury. Rain lashed against the windowpane in violent, horizontal sheets. The old wood of the cabin groaned and shuddered under the assault, each creak and pop a fresh jolt to Sarah's frayed nerves. She lay awake in her sleeping bag, her body rigid, listening to the storm's symphony of chaos. Leo slept soundly beside her, oblivious to the war being waged both outside and within his mother. The ammunition box, though empty and hidden, was a palpable presence in the room. She could feel its cold, metallic weight, a phantom limb she could never be free of. She imagined the old hermit, his face a featureless mask of paranoia, his ghost now a restless sentinel in the raging storm, guarding the treasure he had never been able to spend. Was he watching her now? Was his spectral anger fueling the storm's fury? The thought was irrational, a product of fear and exhaustion. But in the dark, storm-tossed cabin, it felt terrifyingly real. Gus, sensing her distress, whimpered softly and crawled closer, resting his heavy head on her chest. His warmth, his solid, living presence, was a small anchor in the swirling vortex of her fear. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his thick fur. His familiar, doggy scent a comfort against the smell of rain and old wood. The full weight of her dilemma crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. The $2 million, the impossible, life-altering sum, was a curse. To cash the bonds, even a single one, would be to become an accomplice after the fact. It would be a crime. She would be living off the proceeds of a theft, building a new life for her son on a foundation of stolen money. The thought filled her with a deep and profound shame. But the alternative was just as bleak. To do nothing, to leave the bonds to rot in the cupboard, meant condemning herself and Leo to a life of grinding poverty. It meant more nights of canned soup, more winters of shivering in a drafty cabin, more of the quiet desperation that had been her constant companion for months. The moral and practical implications were overwhelming, a tangled knot of fear and desire she couldn't begin to unravel. Could she do it? Could she knowingly commit a crime, even for the sake of her son? And even if she could, how? The articles had been clear. Redeeming such a large sum of old bonds would be next to impossible without attracting the kind of attention that would lead to questions she couldn't answer. The storm raged on, its fury unabated, and Sarah lay in the darkness, trapped between an impossible choice and an unbearable reality, the ghost of a long, dead thief her only confidant. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. The sky, now a brilliant, cloudless blue, seemed to mock the turmoil that had taken permanent residence in Sarah's soul. In the days that followed, she moved through her small, circumscribed world like a ghost, her body performing the necessary tasks of survival, while her mind endlessly replayed the grainy newspaper article and the store owner's grim story. The $2 million, once a symbol of impossible hope, now felt like a millstone around her neck, dragging her down into a dark sea of complicity and fear. The cabin, her only sanctuary, had become a mausoleum, and she was its unwilling curator, the guardian of a dead man's stolen fortune. She tried to find solace in the routine, in the simple, grounding presence of her son and her dog, but the secret was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of every moment, a discordant note that threw everything off-key. One afternoon, desperate to escape the oppressive silence of the cabin, she took Gus for a long walk. Leo was contentedly absorbed in one of the books from the library, a small island of peace she was reluctant to disturb. She followed a narrow, overgrown trail that wound its way down the ridge, the air cool and crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. Gus bounded ahead, his tail a joyful plume, occasionally circling back to nudge her hand with his wet nose, his brown eyes full of a simple, uncomplicated love that made her heart ache. For a few precious moments, surrounded by the quiet majesty of the forest, she felt a flicker of her old self, the woman she had been before the divorce, before the cabin, before the box. She allowed herself to breathe, to feel the sun on her face, to listen to the gentle rustle of the leaves in the breeze. It was a fragile piece, and it was shattered in an instant. As the trail curved back towards the main dirt road, she saw it. Tucked into a small, overgrown clearing half, hidden by a thicket of young birch trees, was a car. It was a black sedan, sleek and modern, its polished surface gleaming even in the dappled shade. It was so utterly out of place in this rustic, forgotten corner of the world that it looked like a prop from a movie set, an alien artifact dropped from another planet. Her heart, which had been beating with a slow, steady rhythm, gave a violent lurch, then began to pound a frantic, panicked tattoo against her ribs. Her hand instinctively tightened on Gus's leash, and he, sensing her sudden fear, stopped, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. This was not a lost tourist. The car was deliberately concealed, its position chosen for observation, not convenience. Her mind raced, a chaotic flood of terrifying possibilities. Was it the police? Had her search at the library somehow triggered an alert? Was there some digital breadcrumb trail she had unknowingly left behind? Or was it someone else? Someone connected to the money, to the robbery, to the hermit? The ghost from the past, the spectral threat she had imagined in the storm, suddenly felt terrifyingly real, its phantom form coalescing into the solid, menacing shape of that black car. She pulled Gus back, deeper into the trees, her movements clumsy with haste. She crouched behind the broad trunk of an ancient oak, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She had to stay. She had to know. Peering through the dense foliage, she watched. The car was silent, still, its tinted windows revealing nothing of who or what was inside. An hour crawled by, each minute an eternity. The sun shifted in the sky, the shadows lengthened, and still, the car did not move. The silence was more terrifying than any sound could have been. It was the silence of a predator, patient and watchful. Then, without warning, the engine purred to life, the sound a low, threatening growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath her. The car pulled slowly out of the clearing, its tires crunching on the gravel of the dirt road. It didn't speed away. It moved with a slow, deliberate laziness, a predator that knew it had all the time in the world. As it passed her hiding place, she held her breath, pressing herself flat against the rough bark of the tree. She couldn't see the driver through the dark glass, but she felt their presence, a cold, unseen gaze that seemed to sweep over the woods, over her, branding her with its silent attention. She stayed frozen, not daring to move, until the sound of the engine had faded completely into the distance. Only then did she allow herself to sag against the tree, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stand. The paranoia was no longer a product of her imagination. It was real. Someone was watching her. The encounter with the black sedan left a permanent scar on her psyche. The cabin, once a symbol of her failure, now felt like a target. Every shadow was a threat, every sound a potential intruder. The fragile piece she had tried to build was shattered, replaced by a constant, gnawing anxiety. A few days later, their supplies once again dwindling, she forced herself to make another trip into Harmony Creek. This time, she took Leo with her, the thought of leaving him alone in the cabin now unbearable. The town was holding its weekly farmers' market on the small village green, and the sight of it, so full of life and color, was a jarring contrast to the gray landscape of her fear. Stalls overflowed with late, seasoned vegetables, homemade jams, and handcrafted goods. The air was filled with the murmur of conversation, the laughter of children, and the faint, sweet smell of apple cider. For a moment, Sarah felt a pang of longing for that kind of normalcy, for a life where her biggest worry was what to make for dinner. As she moved through the small crowd, Leo's hand held tight in hers. She felt a presence at her side. She turned, her body tensing, and found herself looking into the bright, sharp eyes of Agnes. The old woman was holding a basket filled with vibrant red apples, and she smiled, the expression crinkling the network of wrinkles around her eyes. "Hello again, dear," Agnes said. Her voice as warm and comforting as a summer breeze. "Good to see you and your boy enjoying the market." Sarah managed a tight, non-committal smile. "We needed a few things." Agnes's gaze was unervingly direct. She looked from Sarah to Leo, then back to Sarah, her smile softening into something that looked like sympathy, but her eyes held a glint of something else, something sharp and calculating. It was a cunning that seemed utterly at odds with her kindly grandmother facade. She reached out and gently touched Leo's hair. A fine-looking boy, strong. Then her eyes met Sarah's, and the warmth in them vanished, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. "That old cabin has its secrets," Agnes said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, though they were surrounded by the noise of the market. "Some things are better left buried." She paused, letting the words hang in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Then, her smile returned, a quick, bright flash. "But then again," she added, her voice once again light and conversational, "a mother's got to do what's best for her boy, doesn't she?" A chill, as cold and sharp as a shard of ice, slid down Sarah's spine. The words were a perfectly crafted blade, each one a precise and deliberate cut. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. It was a warning. Or was it a test? An invitation? Sarah's mind reeled, struggling to decipher the hidden meaning, the terrifying ambiguity of the old woman's words. She opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. She felt like a fish in a net, struggling against a force she couldn't see or understand. Agnes simply patted her arm, the same gesture she had used in the store, but this time it felt less like a welcome and more like a claim, a brand. "You have a good day now, dear," she said, and with another one of her unsettlingly knowing smiles, she turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Sarah standing frozen, her heart pounding a deafening rhythm in her ears. The cheerful sounds of the market faded to a dull roar. She no longer knew if Agnes was an ally or an enemy, a guardian angel or the devil in disguise. And that, she realized with a fresh wave of terror, was the most frightening thing of all. The drive back to the cabin was a silent one. Sarah's mind was a maelstrom of Agnes's cryptic words and the image of the black sedan. The two events were connected. She was sure of it. The feeling of being watched, of being tested, was overwhelming. She clutched the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her gaze darting nervously to the rearview mirror every few seconds. Leo, sensing her distress, was quiet, his small face a mask of worry. As she turned off the main road and onto the long, winding dirt track that led to the cabin, a sense of dread so profound it was almost nauseating washed over her. She saw it from 100 yards away. The cabin door. It was ajar, not wide open, but pushed inward just enough to create a dark, vertical slash against the gray wood of the frame. She was certain, absolutely certain, that she had locked it. She had checked the knob twice before they left, a new ritual born of her escalating paranoia. She slammed on the brakes, the old sedan skidding to a halt in a cloud of dust. Her first thought was a bolt of pure, unadulterated panic. The bonds. "Stay in the car, Leo," she commanded, her voice sharp, strained. "Lock the doors." He looked at her, his eyes wide with fear, but he nodded, his small hand reaching over to push down the lock. She got out of the car, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. Gus was already on high alert, a low, continuous growl vibrating in his chest. The fur along his spine bristled. She moved towards the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence of the woods felt different now, charged with a menacing energy. The cabin, their only refuge, now looked like a trap, its open door a gaping mouth waiting to swallow her whole. She pushed the door open with a tentative hand. It swung inward with a low, mournful creak. Inside, at first glance, nothing seemed out of place. The sleeping bags were still rolled out on the floor. The few dishes they owned were stacked neatly by the sink. The books from the library were in a tidy pile on the table. But the feeling of violation was intense, a physical presence in the air. The room smelled different, a faint, unfamiliar scent mingling with the familiar smells of wood smoke and dust. Someone had been inside. Gus moved ahead of her, his nose to the ground, his growl deepening as he sniffed at the floor near the hearth. Sarah's eyes darted around the room, her mind cataloging every detail, searching for any sign of disturbance. Nothing. It was as if a ghost had passed through, leaving no trace but the lingering sense of its presence. This wasn't a simple burglary. A common thief would have been messy, would have tossed the place looking for valuables. This was something else. This was a message. Her breath hitched. With a surge of adrenaline, she lunged towards the cupboard by the hearth. Her hands trembled as she tore at the stack of old, musty blankets, pulling them out and tossing them onto the floor in a frantic heap. Her fingers scrabbled in the dark, empty space at the back of the cupboard. For a heart-stopping second, she felt nothing but rough, splintered wood. Then, her fingertips brushed against the familiar, greasy texture of the oilcloth. It was there. She pulled the bundle out, its weight a sudden, shocking relief. She tore at the twine, her fingers fumbling, and peeled back the layers of cloth. The bonds were all there, the neat stacks of paper undisturbed. A wave of dizziness washed over her, a confusing mixture of profound relief and renewed, intensified terror. They hadn't taken it. They had been in the cabin, they had searched, but they hadn't taken the money. Why? Had they not found it? Or was this part of the game? Were they playing with her, letting her know that they could get to it and to her whenever they wanted? This was the turning point. The threat was no longer a passive, watchful presence. It was active. It was inside her home. It had breathed the same air as her and her son. The black sedan, Agnes's cryptic words, the open door, it all clicked into place, forming a terrifying, undeniable picture. Someone knew, or at least they suspected, and they were getting closer. The panic that had been a constant, low hum in her veins for days now crescendoed into a shrill, screaming alarm. The cabin was no longer a refuge. It was a cage, and the door had just been rattled. She had to make a decision. She had to act, and she had to do it fast. The time for fear and indecision was over. Now it was time for survival. The sun was bleeding out across the horizon, painting the undersides of the clouds in lurid shades of orange and purple. The beauty of it was a cruel mockery. Dusk was falling, and with it, the shadows around the cabin deepened, no longer just pockets of darkness but grasping, predatory things. Sarah stood in the center of the small room, the oilcloth bundle clutched to her chest like a shield. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. The time for fear was over, she had told herself, but fear was a living entity, a parasite with its roots sunk deep into her soul. It was survival now. The word echoed in her mind, a hollow drumbeat against the frantic pounding of her heart. She had to think. She had to plan. But her thoughts were a chaotic storm, a whirlwind of the black sedan, Agnes's knowing eyes, and the terrifying, silent violation of her home. A sharp, sudden knock on the door made her jump so violently that she nearly cried out. Gus, who had been pacing restlessly at her feet, erupted into a volley of deep, ferocious barks, his body rigid, his teeth bared at the door. "Leo, stay back," she whispered, her voice a choked, strangled thing. She pushed him gently towards the far corner of the room, away from the door, away from the window. The knock came again, harder this time, more insistent. "Sarah, dear? It's just me, Agnes. Is everything all right?" I heard shouting. Agnes. The name sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. Her voice was the same, warm and neighborly, but Sarah heard it differently now. She heard the cunning beneath the kindness, the steel beneath the velvet. She clutched the bundle tighter. Gus continued to bark, a furious, unbroken rhythm of warning. "I know you're in there, dear," Agnes called out, her tone losing a fraction of its warmth, replaced by a thin, sharp edge of impatience. "Your car is right outside. Open the door. We need to talk." The word hung in the air, as heavy and as menacing as a hangman's noose. Sarah's eyes darted to the window. In the fading light, she could just make out the silhouette. Agnes was not alone. Standing just behind her, a looming shadow of a man, was the unmistakable shape of the person she had seen with the black sedan. He was tall and broad, a figure of pure, brute physicality. Her mind raced. She could scream, but who would hear her? She could try to barricade the door, but the flimsy lock would not hold for long against a determined assault. She was trapped. The realization was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. With a trembling hand, she reached down and quieted Gus, her fingers digging into the thick fur of his neck. His growling subsided to a low, continuous rumble, a promise of violence held barely in check. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she walked to the door. Her hand hovered over the knob for a heart-stopping second. Then she turned it. Agnes stood on the sagging porch, a basket of apples still hooked over one arm, a grotesque parody of her earlier, kindly persona. The warm, grandmotherly smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold, hard resolve. Her bright eyes, which had once seemed so full of life, were now as flat and as gray as river stones. And beside her, the man. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with a face that was a mask of sullen indifference. His eyes were as cold as his grandmother's, but where hers held a sharp, calculating intelligence, his held only a dull, brutish emptiness. He was the muscle. Agnes was the brain. "There now," Agnes said, her voice devoid of all its previous warmth. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" She stepped inside, her presence immediately filling the small cabin, sucking all the air out of it. The man followed, his bulk seeming to block out the last of the dying light from the doorway. He closed the door behind him with a soft, final click. Sarah backed away, pulling Leo behind her, her body a shield between her son and the intruders. Gus stood his ground, his lips curled back in a silent snarl. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling but firm. Agnes let out a short, dry laugh. It was a sound utterly devoid of humor. "Oh, I think you know what I want, dear. I want what's mine. I want my inheritance." Her eyes flicked down to the oilcloth bundle clutched in Sarah's hands. "You've been a busy little bee, haven't you? Tearing up the floorboards. Took you long enough. I was beginning to think I'd have to come in and do it myself." The casualness of the admission, the sheer, entitled arrogance of it, stunned Sarah into silence. Agnes had been watching her all along, testing her, waiting. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Agnes sighed, a long, theatrical sound of exasperation. "Please, let's not play games. It's so tiresome. My grandson here," she said, gesturing to the silent man beside her. "He gets impatient. He's not much for games." The man's cold eyes flickered towards Sarah, and for the first time, she saw a spark of something in their depths, a cruel, vacant hunger. "The man who lived here," Agnes continued, her voice taking on a strange, wistful quality. "He was my love, a difficult man, a paranoid man, but he was mine. He never trusted banks, you see. He always said the only thing you could trust was gold and the ground. When he pulled that job in Sterling City all those years ago, back in 1975, I was the one driving the car. It was supposed to be our future, but he got scared. He ran. He came here to this miserable little box, and he buried it. Our future. He told me if anything ever happened to him, it was mine. He died in this room, and I've been waiting. For decades, I've watched this cabin rot, watched people come and go, waiting for someone with just the right amount of desperation to finally find what he hid." Her gaze settled on Sarah, hard and unforgiving. "You have the desperation, and now you have my money." The story, the confession, it all came tumbling out, a torrent of long, simmering resentment and greed. The betrayal was absolute, the shattering of the last, faint hope Sarah had held for some form of kindness, of alliance, in this desolate place. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone, trapped in a dead man's tomb with his ghost's greedy lover and her monstrous heir. "Now," Agnes said, her voice dropping, becoming as sharp and as cold as a shard of glass. Be a good girl and give me what's mine. The air in the cabin was thick with menace, a palpable, suffocating thing. Agnes stood with an air of absolute certainty, her hand outstretched, not in supplication, but in demand. Her grandson shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a subtle, menacing movement that made the old floorboards groan. He was a coiled spring, radiating a quiet, brutal impatience. Sarah's mind, which had been a chaotic storm of panic, suddenly became still, preternaturally clear. The terror was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but something else was rising to meet it. A fierce, primal instinct, hot and sharp. It was the protective fury of a mother, an animalistic imperative to defend her young at any cost. She was no longer just a victim. She was a cornered animal, and cornered animals were the most dangerous of all. No, she said, the word a quiet, solid thing in the tense silence. Agnes's eyebrows shot up. A flicker of genuine surprise, quickly replaced by annoyance, crossed her face. No, my dear girl, I don't think you understand the position you're in. I understand perfectly, Sarah countered, her voice gaining strength, drawing from some hidden well of courage she never knew she possessed. She took a step back, maneuvering herself so that the pot-bellied wood stove was between her and them. The fire she had banked before the walk was still alive, a bed of glowing red embers radiating a steady, intense heat. It was the only source of warmth in the room, and now the only source of hope. You're in my home, you're threatening my son, and you're not taking anything. The grandson took a step forward, his face twisting into a sneer. Just give it to her, lady. Don't make this difficult. Stay back, Sarah warned, her eyes darting around the room, her mind racing, cataloging every object, every angle, every possibility. The cabin, her prison, was now her chessboard. She knew its every weakness, its every secret. She knew the floorboard that groaned, the window that stuck, the way the shadows fell in the fading light. Agnes held up a hand, stopping her grandson in his tracks. She studied Sarah with a new, grudging respect. You have spirit. I'll give you that. But spirit doesn't change the facts. There are two of us and one of you, and your boy. It would be a shame if he were to get hurt. The threat, so casually delivered, sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through Sarah's veins. It was a mistake. It was the one thing that burned away the last vestiges of her fear, leaving only a cold, hard resolve. She had to end this. Now, she had to create an opportunity, a single moment of chaos that she could use to her advantage. Her gaze fell upon the telephone, a dusty old rotary model on a small table near the door. It was a prop, a relic left over from a previous tenant, completely disconnected. But they didn't know that. You're too late, Sarah said, her voice ringing with a conviction that almost made her believe the lie herself. The police are on their way. Agnes's smile was thin, dismissive. Don't be ridiculous. There's no phone line up here. I have a cell phone, Sarah bluffed, her mind working furiously. I called them from town when I saw your car. I told them everything. About the robbery in 1975. About the bonds. About you. They know you're here. The lie, so bold and specific, gave Agnes pause. A flicker of uncertainty, of doubt, crossed her face. She looked at her grandson, a silent question passing between them. The man just shrugged, his brutish confidence unshaken. She's lying. Let's just take it and go. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Agnes was cunning, a planner. She wouldn't have survived this long by being reckless. She was weighing the odds, calculating the risk. It was the opening Sarah needed, the split second of hesitation that could mean the difference between life and death. She knew the bluff wouldn't hold for long. She needed more than a lie. She needed a weapon. Her eyes locked on the wood stove, on the glowing red heart of the fire within. The standoff stretched for another agonizing minute, the silence in the room so thick it was almost a sound in itself. Gus's low growl was a constant, vibrating threat. Leo, bless his brave, terrified heart, remained silent in the corner, his eyes wide, fixed on his mother. Sarah could see the doubt in Agnes's eyes warring with her greed. But she could also see the grandson's impatience growing, his knuckles flexing and unflexing at his sides. The bluff was crumbling. It was now or never. In a single, fluid motion born of pure, desperate instinct, Sarah acted. She lunged for the wood stove, grabbing the heavy iron poker that rested against the hearth. It was cool in her hand, a solid, reassuring weight. With a guttural cry that was part rage, part terror, she hooked the poker around the handle of the stove's small iron door and wrenched it open. A wave of heat, intense and suffocating, blasted out, along with a shower of bright orange sparks. Agnes and her grandson flinched back, momentarily blinded by the sudden, brilliant light. It was the only opening she would get. Without a second's hesitation, Sarah plunged the poker deep into the heart of the stove, into the bed of glowing embers. She scooped up a heavy mass of burning wood and hot ash, a miniature volcano of fire and light. With a final, desperate heave, she flung the contents of the poker across the floor, directly at their feet. The effect was instantaneous. The dry, ancient floorboards ignited with a whoosh, the flames spreading with terrifying speed. Thick, acrid smoke billowed up, filling the small cabin, choking the air. Agnes screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain as a stray ember landed on her arm. Her grandson swore, batting at the flames that were licking at his boots, his face a mask of confusion and rage. The chaos was her cover. "Leo, now!" she screamed, her voice raw from the smoke. She grabbed the oilcloth bundle from the floor where she had dropped it and shoved it into his arms. "Run! Don't stop! No matter what!" She didn't wait to see if he obeyed. She grabbed his hand, her grip like a vice, and pulled him towards the door. Gus, barking frantically, was already there, a loyal, furry sentinel leading the way. They burst out of the cabin and into the cool, clean air of the falling night, leaving the scene of chaos and fire behind them. The cabin, which had been their prison, was now a funeral pyre for Agnes's greed. Sarah didn't look back. She could hear shouts from inside the burning cabin, but they were already distant, swallowed by the roar of her own blood in her ears. She plunged into the woods, the darkness wrapping around them like a cloak. The forest, once a symbol of her isolation and fear, was now their only ally, its tangled undergrowth and deep shadows their only hope for cover. Branches whipped at her face, thorns tore at her clothes, but she didn't slow down. She ran, fueled by a primal, heart-pounding terror, pulling her son behind her, the faithful Labrador at their heels, fleeing into the vast, dark wilderness, with only a stolen fortune and a desperate hope for survival to their names. The adrenaline of the escape was a fire in Sarah's veins, burning away thought, leaving only the primal instinct to run. They crashed through the undergrowth, the darkness of the woods absolute, a suffocating blanket pricked only by the distant, indifferent stars. The air was cold and sharp in her lungs, each breath a painful gasp. Leo stumbled beside her, his small hand a vice in hers, his quiet sobs lost to the frantic rustle of their own passage and the pounding of her heart. Gus, a shadow of silent loyalty, ranged ahead, his panting the only sound that felt safe in the vast, menacing silence. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs screamed in protest, until the orange glow of the burning cabin was a faint, flickering memory against the night sky. They found a deep thicket and collapsed, huddling together on the damp, cold earth, a miserable, terrified heap of humanity and dog. The oilcloth bundle, a strange, lumpy baby, was still clutched in Leo's arms. For hours they waited, listening. The distant wail of a siren, a single, lonely cry in the wilderness, eventually rose and fell, a sign that their chaotic diversion had worked. The world was now aware of the fire on the ridge. After an eternity, when the woods had settled back into their natural, nocturnal rhythm, Sarah made a decision. They crept back, moving like ghosts along the edge of the tree line, until their beat, up sedan came into view. A small metal island of hope parked far enough down the road to have been overlooked. They drove without headlights for the first few miles, navigating by the pale light of the moon, every shadow a potential threat. Once on the paved highway, Sarah pressed the accelerator to the floor, the small engine whining in protest as they put as much distance as possible between themselves and the smoldering ruins of their life in Harmony Creek. They drove for hours, 100 miles, then 200, the hypnotic rhythm of the road a strange, numbing balm. Finally, as the first, pale hints of dawn bruised the eastern sky, she saw it, a flickering neon sign that promised vacancy. It was a cheap, anonymous motel off a secondary highway, a place for people who didn't want to be found. She paid for the room with the last of the crumpled cash she had, her hands shaking as she signed a false name in the greasy ledger. The room was small and smelled of stale cigarette smoke and disinfectant. A single bare bulb cast a harsh, unflattering light on the two beds with their thin, patterned bedspreads and the scarred wooden furniture. It was ugly and impersonal, and to Sarah, it was the most beautiful sanctuary she had ever seen. Leo, his face pale and smudged with soot, collapsed onto one of the beds and was asleep in seconds. Gus, after a long drink from the bathroom sink, curled up on the floor at the foot of his bed, his body emitting a low, exhausted sigh. Sarah locked the door, bolted the chain, and sagged against it, the adrenaline finally draining away, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She looked at her son, his small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep, and at the loyal dog who had not left their side. She looked at the oilcloth bundle, which she had placed on the other bed, its lumpy form a silent testament to the chaos of the last 12 hours. They had nothing. They were fugitives, running from a crime they hadn't committed, carrying a fortune they couldn't use. And yet, as she stood there in that cheap, sterile room, a strange and liberating clarity washed over her. They were free. Free from the cabin, free from the whispers of the town, free from the menacing shadow of Agnes and her grandson. They had nothing but each other and a box of stolen money, but they were alive, and they were together. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of trucks rumbling past on the highway. The exhaustion had settled into a dull ache in her bones, but her mind was sharp, clear. She knew they couldn't run forever. The bonds were a link to a crime, a tether that could be traced. And Agnes, though likely dealing with the law, was a loose end, a venomous thread that could unravel their new life before it even began. She had to cut the ties. All of them. She found what she was looking for at a grimy gas station a few miles down the road. A payphone bolted to the brick wall, its receiver cold and heavy in her hand. She fed the coins into the slot, her heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm, and dialed the number for the state police. Her voice, when she spoke to the dispatcher, was low and steady, stripped of all emotion. "I have information about the fire at the old cabin on Ridge Road, outside of Harmony Creek," she said, her words precise, rehearsed. She gave them Agnes's name, a detailed physical description, and the make and model of the black sedan. She told them about the bank robbery in Sterling City in 1975, the one that was never solved. "The woman's name is Agnes," she repeated. "She was the robber's accomplice. She's been waiting for him to die to claim the money he stole. She set the fire to cover her tracks after she tried to kill the woman and child living there. She didn't mention the bonds. She didn't mention that she was the woman, that Leo was the child. She was an anonymous tipster, a disembodied voice on a crackling line, a ghost settling an old score. She gave them the facts, a clean, sharp narrative of greed and violence, and then she gently placed the receiver back in its cradle, the click of the connection severing echoing in the quiet morning air. She stood there for a long moment, her hand still resting on the phone. A profound sense of rightness, of empowerment, settled over her. It was an act of release. She was letting go of the tainted money, but in a way that ensured justice or some form of it would be served. She was no longer a victim of circumstance, a pawn in a dead man's story. In that single, anonymous act, she had taken control of her own destiny. She was not going to be a millionaire. She was going to be something far more valuable, a woman of integrity, a mother who could look her son in the eye without the shadow of a lie between them. A quiet strength filled her, a resolve as solid and as real as the concrete beneath her feet. She had made her choice. A few months later, the oppressive humidity of a late summer afternoon was giving way to the promise of a cooler evening. In a small, sunny town in a state 1,000 miles from the dark pines of Harmony Creek, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the maple trees that lined the quiet residential street. Laughter from a nearby park drifted through the open window of a second-floor apartment, a cheerful, carefree sound that had become the new soundtrack to Sarah's life. The apartment was small, but it was clean and bright, and every corner of it was theirs. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the peaceful, domestic scene. Gus was sleeping in a patch of that sunlight, his paws twitching as he dreamed, his soft snores a gentle, rhythmic counterpoint to the ticking of a clock on the wall. Sarah stood at the kitchen counter, her hands dusted with flour, the warm, comforting smell of baking bread filling the air. She had found a job at a local bakery, a place of warmth and simple, honest work. The early mornings were hard, but the satisfaction of creating something with her own hands, of earning her own way, was a reward far greater than any paycheck. She had cashed a single bond, just one. She had taken a bus to a sprawling, anonymous city 3 states over and found a discreet broker who asked few questions, a man who specialized in the quiet liquidation of complicated assets. The process had been terrifying, but it had given them just enough, a small, clean stake to build a new life. It was enough for the first and last month's rent on the apartment, for new clothes for Leo, for a used car that actually ran without protest. It was enough for a fresh start. Leo came into the kitchen, his face bright, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He was enrolled in the local school, and for the first time in a long time he was thriving. He was making friends, his quiet watchfulness replaced by the easy confidence of a boy who felt safe, who felt at home. He dropped his backpack on the floor and wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her side. "I like it here, Mom," he said, his voice muffled by her apron. Sarah stopped kneading the dough and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight. She kissed the top of his head, breathing in the scent of his hair, a mix of sunshine and boyish sweat. "Me too, sweetie," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion so profound it almost hurt. "Me too." It was a peace she had never imagined possible, a hard, one happiness that was more precious than any fortune. Later that evening, as she was putting away laundry, she opened the closet in her bedroom. In the very back, behind a stack of sweaters, sat the old tin ammunition box. It was empty now, a hollow metal shell. She ran her fingers over its cool, scarred surface. It was no longer a source of fear or temptation. It was a reminder, a silent, solemn monument to the journey that had brought them here. The real treasure, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, had never been the $2 million. It was the strength she had found in the depths of her own despair, the fierce, unwavering love for her son, and the quiet, simple joy of a normal life, a life she had rebuilt, piece by piece, from the ashes of another.